Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we meet Cory Alpert, an academic who is taking the discussions about AI to small regional communities across Australia. But first, our regular look at the latest tech news with panellists, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you all in the virtual room for another fortnight. Lizzie, welcome back from India.
Thank you. Great to be back home.
Dan, welcome to Sunset in Perth. Looking like it's beautiful over there this evening.
Yes, it's a bit earlier in the day today, so I've got the sun in my eyes, but good to be here all the same.
And our special guest this week is Cory Alpert, who's both, I don't know how we'll describe you. We were put in touch through Meredith per Capita. You're doing some really interesting outreach. You're doing study in Australia, but you've also worked inside the beast in Washington. So really looking forward to unpacking your brain, Cory.
Great, thanks for having me.
So for Cory's benefit and first-time listeners, our format is pretty simple. We talk about what's been going on and grabbing our attention from around the globe, and then we dig deep into the work of our special guest. But Cory, we're looking forward to your contributions as we go. I reckon we kick off, Lizzie, with your chosen story for your return to Australia, which is actually Meta's win in the US antitrust case around its ownership of everything from WhatsApp to Instagram. So what's gone on there and why should we care?
Yeah, so this was a much anticipated decision about whether, Facebook was in breach of American competition law and consumer protection regimes by acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp. And ultimately, what the judges decided is that it did not have a monopoly in personal social networking. And part of this, it sort of reminded me of the Google decision, actually. Part of this is about the fact that social media has kind of moved on. And what is meant by that is now it was evidenced in kind of the evidence that Mark Zuckerberg gave earlier in the year. He attempted to essentially say that it was not about locking people into using social media networks based on who they were friends with and who their family was and where they were. But in fact, Facebook competes with lots of other, and Meta competes with lots of other social media platforms for surfacing content. And one of the biggest reasons people now use Facebook is actually to watch video. And this was not what the FTC had put forward as the claim around its anti-competitive behavior, because, of course, at the time that Meta acquired Instagram and WhatsApp, social networking was totally different. So there's this question around whether the idea of social networking versus social media is now a distinction that's reasonable. I'm sort of not surprised on one level that the reason this case was unsuccessful was around the definition of markets, because for people interested in competition law, this is always the very contentious issue. But again, I feel like with the Google decision, there's sort of a forest for trees scenario here where the judge says, well, actually, Meta now has to compete with TikTok and YouTube, for example, so it doesn't hold a monopoly in relation to social media. The reality is Facebook's acquisition of what was competitors at the time, even that can be even an argument made consistent with the judge's reasoning, gave it the capacity to influence the model that it now uses to make money. So using essentially video and other kinds of surfacing of content to service its advertising business model. So to me, it's a disappointing decision. It's now the second such decision. I'd written about like the relationship between the Trump administration and the consumer competition regulators and big tech, and how this dynamic works recently for the BAFLA in relation to the Google decision. And I talked about how the relationship between kind of MAGA state power and big tech is I described it as volatile attempts at mutual containment. And I feel like that is still underway. Like there's this uneasy relationship where, of course, the Trump administration is leaning into AI, but also carrying forward cases that were started, some of which were started under the previous Trump administration, but also like big talk around concerns around anti-competitive behavior by big tech. And there's this kind of tension between those two positions. This is a loss for the FTC. I don't think it's entirely unexpected, but it does sort of suggest that this attempt to bring cases like this that take such a long time to mature is not always going to result in decisions that benefit consumers or that really unpick some of the competitive advantages that these mega platforms have created for themselves. So,
Because antitrust was kind of the great white hope under Biden, wasn't it? There was the activist head of the FTC. There was a number of cases. But have there been any wins on the board since Trump's come in?
well, yeah, like the Google ones went two different ways. Like it's not. There's a question of like Google was found to have engaged in anti-competitive behavior, but the remedy that was ordered was not what everybody thought would be the case. You know, as in the breakup of its Chrome browser from the rest of its business. So yeah, but it is a bit of a concern. Like I talk about this in the article, maybe we can put it on the page for the pod episode. But the new head of the FTC has talked about actually the concerns around limits on conservative speech as a problem that the FTC wants to concern itself with. So I remain worried that this can actually become a weapon for increased state influence over platforms that people rely on for basic infrastructure of the web. So it's not even just like a failure of antitrust to deliver on more competitive markets for consumers and improved consumer protection. It's actually a concern around how state power can be used to influence also how this infrastructure of the web works through using the same competition and consumer tools. This has always been a tension in the law. Like it's traditionally been seen as a conservative field of law. There is an argument for it to be associated with more progressive causes, but there is an inherent tension between the two. But it doesn't look promising that what we're going to see is this new dawn of improved consumer protection or diverse markets for a whole range of online services that perhaps was hoped for towards the end of the last administration.
Cory, you're a keen watcher of the administration and been writing regular columns for Fairfax. How do you see these these cases playing out in terms of the bigger story of where America's going at the moment?
Yeah, so like Lizzie was saying, this case was brought under the first Trump administration, which had a much different relationship with a lot of these companies, with Silicon Valley, and then was pushed through with the help of 46 states. So this was a bipartisan effort and something that really crossed the United States and something that was really front of mind, especially 6 or 8 months into the pandemic. And then under President Biden, which where the FTC was led by Lena Khan, who Peter, like you said, was quite activist and quite pro-consumer, and I think was the person that gave these big tech CEOs and big CEOs of any company a lot of nightmares, and will continue to do so now that she's working with Zoran Mamdani in New York. But now, like Lizzie was saying, I think that this second Trump administration has a radically different relationship with Silicon Valley. In particular, obviously, with big business, this is probably the most friendly administration for big business in a very long time, especially given how the president sees himself and the world in which the president inhabits. Many of these CEOs are members of Mar-a-Lago and spend a lot of their time around the president. But beyond that, this administration really is deeply intertwined with Silicon Valley, and I think that's what this story is a harbinger of. Is I think this administration is going to see a ruling like this as though the law is on the side of Silicon Valley, and this administration I think sees Silicon Valley and sees the American tech ecosystem as hopefully becoming an arm of that state power. We're seeing that with what they're doing with Palantir and a bunch of these other big tech companies and trying to build their relationships. I wrote in the Fairfax papers during Trump's inauguration about how the people seated in the front row were not rank and file Republicans. They weren't members of the community. They were the big tech CEOs sitting right there. I think we really have to read the way that this administration is approaching those companies and those leaders really critically. And I think this case is going to become really important for how the administration interprets the power and the space that these companies inhabit, not just in American life, but in life across the world.
Look, I think it's just a shame that it took so long to get to this point, because I think if you had there was probably a better chance of this case being won had it come about before the rise of TikTok sort of taking over the world. Because, I've seen this, I've seen the impact of this from a digital advertising point of view in trying to compete with Google and Facebook. And, there was absolutely a time when it was just a duopoly. It was really just Google and Facebook before they became Meta that basically took, almost all of the digital advertising dollars and left publishers, which is where I was working previously, to sort of fight over the scraps. And it might not have been a monopoly, but it was that they definitely had, capital less substantial market power, and that was to the detriment of everybody that was trying to compete with them. So yes, I mean, now the ruling isn't a huge surprise. They're competing with, Instagram has effectively become a video platform, and largely one that's not about your friends anyway, right? So they really are competing with YouTube and competing with TikTok now more than they were. But not that long ago, a few years ago, it was a social media platform when your social network mattered and the people you were connected with mattered. And they were the only game in town. They were the only one that really had any position there. And because of that, they took a huge amount of market share. So I think it is inarguable that we would have had a much healthier, more competitive online advertising economy or whatever circumstance had Facebook not been able to acquire Instagram. I'm less concerned about WhatsApp, although I'm still concerned about it. But them not being able to acquire Instagram would have been a good thing, because in that circumstance, you would have at least ended up with a third player for the last decade before TikTok came along. And because it was effectively a duopoly, that gave them the right to do all the terrible things they've done with privacy invasion and surveillance and everything else. Now, maybe Instagram would have gone down that path too, but I think there is at least a hope that they wouldn't have gone that far. And so, look, it's not a surprise, the result. It's a shame. And I just wish that, it had have been, the case had been brought much earlier. Or at the very least, I wish that it hadn't been approved, I guess, if you go back to the beginning, because it would have given others a chance to compete.
Yeah, it's almost like a sliding door moment, Lizzie. One of the books I've been ploughing through amongst many is Cory Doctorow's fantastic new book, Intricacies, and he looks at not just the antitrust cases around Microsoft's dominance in the early days of the internet, but then what that created out the other end of it, which was that very dynamic period before things enshittified.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, also, it does impact what we experience. Like the ACCC has talked about the fact that it needs improved powers to block mergers, for example. But there's only so much that we can do about that, the offering of services from foreign companies abroad. So it has an impact on us. I mean, it does occur to me that now, like, that one of the few ways you can kind of protect yourself from these very large companies dominating the provision of digital advertising is through information control, like privacy protection. But I think it is also interesting that what we're seeing across the Atlantic is then a potential weakening of GDPR now being canvassed by lawmakers there, which is also alarming. So we are really creating a situation where we're just allowing consumers to be used by these large platforms. We should be trying to do something about it, but I just wonder whether there'll be enough bravery among our lawmakers in circumstances where it seems like the EU is not holding its nerve. I mean, I would say the reasoning that the judge gave as to how people use Facebook did ring true for me. I don't know if this is true for everyone else, but I do not use it to hear from my friends. I barely use it. And when I use it, it's often AI slop. And I do wonder what's the sustainability of that model. Like, you do kind of, they're diversifying the kinds of products that they are offering through that app, but at some point there'll be another competition problem for them if they keep trying to do that, right? Like, so I don't know. You do wonder how Facebook's going to innovate out of this problem it's got for itself, in that people aren't using it for its traditional purpose, but they don't get that lock-in or that network effect from being on the same platform as their friends, which they've basically admitted to.
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to be the metaverse, whatever they're innovating.
No.
But Dan, staying on Meta and closer to home, Labor has put forward its news bargaining incentive, which is particularly focused on Meta. As somebody that was deeply involved in the first iteration of the News Media Bargaining Code, how's this looking to you?
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings about this. I like parts of it, and other parts I'm a bit troubled by. So I'll give a bit of background, because I suspect that not everyone's been following it as closely as certainly all of us have. But yeah, so the Australian Treasury, they released a consultation paper last week on what, the evolution of the News Media Bargaining Code, if you like. It's now the News Bargaining Incentive. And, it's designed to apply to large digital platforms. So, specifically those that are earning more than $250 million a year in search and social media services. And so the model is different this time around, because under the proposed model, the platforms would each face a charge equal to 2.25% of their Australian revenue. But if they enter into or renew commercial deals with Australian news publishers, then effectively that gets discounted, and effectively can get discounted down to nothing. So it's different to the News Media Bargaining Code, which I was pretty heavily involved with when I was at The Guardian, because there's actually an upper limit which is placed on it from that 2.25% of how much they're going to be giving to publishers. But it also it snookers Meta in a way, in particular, because it applies whether or not you carry news on your service or not. And this is where I start to get sort of mixed feelings about it, because in one sense, Meta doing what they have done in Canada, when Canada tried to introduce their own News Media Bargaining Code, resulted in news being taken off the platform completely. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, by the way. I mean, it's bad in the sense that publishers didn't get any revenue from Meta. But I just wonder if, Meta being a place where people get news, and social media being a place where people get news, has not been a good thing for society. Now, maybe the horse has bolted, and maybe it's too late, and maybe there is an obligation on them to carry news now, because that's where most people are spending their time. And so
But
I guess
it's not, is it? Is it where people, or are people finding it in other places? Like, is there something flawed in the design of this?
Look, I'm not as close to it as I used to be, but I think the stats are still that more than half of the population are getting their news information from social media. So, I guess if that is the circumstance, what's worse, having no news on there at all, which basically just allows the crazies to have full reign, or to have regular publishers on there that are given some prominence. And I guess this is the point, right? So the government's position, I think, from what they've announced here, is that, or likely position, is that it is better that news is being carried on search and social media. But if you're going to go that far, I think you need to go further than this and have must carry obligations, because the circumstance we've got now is that the Meta and Google in particular, and now TikTok, have to pay news publishers for using for the use of their, or not even for the use of their content. They have to pay for them regardless. That's almost just, they have to pay a social license to be able to operate in Australia, whether or not they carry news. But if they do carry, if you do think that these publishers or these platforms have a role to play in informing the public, then I think you should have must carry obligations as part of this. And then what's critical is that you need to also then have some reporting obligations and some transparency obligations to show how much of regular, reputable publishers are being prioritized in your algorithm, and therefore how much is actually influencing people's perspective on society. So I kind of hate the fact that people are going to social media to get their news, and I think it would be a better circumstance if no one did that. But maybe that's just too late for that. And so in that circumstance, I think what I would rather see is, by all means, keep the payment going to news publishers. They certainly need it in order to be able to fund their operations. But I think also have must carry obligations, and as part of that, have some obligations on them to be able to surface reputable news sources, instead of the conspiracy theories which tend to get most of the attention on the social media platforms. What do others think?
Lizzie, it's fair to say you never loved the News Media Bargaining Code. Has anything shifted in the latest iteration for you?
No, although I sort of don't agree with a few different things that Dan just said, which is probably standard. Like, what is news? What is a reputable news organization? Like, what is the what does it mean to obtain your news from a platform? Like, if you're covering conflicts now, social media is a big part of people's real lived experience of those conflicts being broadcast to the world. I don't love that those people have to rely on a few small companies to deliver that. But I also think then demonizing social media as the venue for receiving news does tend to put that in the same bucket, right, as other ways in which the algorithm shapes what people understand in what's in the public domain that is a problem, right? Or that also journalism is being written and optimized for that algorithm instead of focusing on quality content. So the problems are much more complicated, I think, than just people getting too much news from social media. But I do agree, like the transparency stuff is very important. I mean, I'd be interested to know what a must-carry obligation might look like, especially for right-wing news sites that people don't like or that have been deplatformed. This is a very concerning issue, how you enforce that must carry against platforms that you don't like or service delivery that you don't like. So there's some complexity there. I mean, I think the reality is that what we should be doing is trying to tax these large technology companies more. We maybe aren't in the position to do that. So what do we do instead? Or we can't do that without soliciting, the 800-pound gorilla across the Pacific from, potentially imposing tariffs because we're engaging in anti-competitive behavior against their darling companies. This is the world that we're in, and it's frustrating because it means you're not free to make policy that is based on optimized outcomes, but is then in a geopolitical context. That may not last for more than another 3 years, who knows? But I do think it is worth noting the shortcomings of this, notwithstanding I understand the limitations in which we are making this policy.
Can I just jump in really quickly? Sorry, before you get a word in, Cory. So I think I agree with a lot of what you've just said there, Lizzie. The issue we've got, though, right, with this circumstance is it is almost like a tax on their revenue, which is going to the benefit of news publishers. But the problem now is that Meta then gets to decide where that goes without any obligations on carrying news in the first place. So you end up with a tax, sure, but it's a tax where now Meta is able to pick winners completely in the shadows. And I think that's
Agreed.
a worse...
But hasn't the whole news media bargaining code been in the shadows? Like, one of the criticisms when it first came through was that, yes, we never knew how much different publishers got because it was commercial in confidence. We also didn't know if they actually used it on news or if there were, all these arguments that some of them, not The Guardian, I might add, were using them to push up their share price or, using it, for other reasons other than the production of news. So I'm also wondering, if you designed it again, like, how do you build that transparency into it, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's one of the lessons, right? I think having some transparency, in the previous system, that would have made it better, right? And some obligations on the money being used to fund public interest journalism. Because, I mean, it was a market failure, but there's market failures everywhere. The ACCC doesn't intervene in all of those things, but they intervened in this one because journalism is a public good. And so, therefore, I think some transparency around the investment back into that public good would have made it better and also would have removed a lot of the criticism of the scheme previously. So this is the thing. I think we haven't really solved that problem with this. We've gone into a pretty elegant way of making the platforms pay and not be able to get out of it, but it doesn't solve some of the issues that existed with the previous model. And I'm not sure that's a better outcome.
Yeah, Cory,
tell us.
What's your take on this? Yeah, from it's obviously a uniquely Australian concept that's gone out to the world. Cynics would say that it was, the baby of Murdoch and News Limited trying to find a way of extracting a bit of value exchange, and everyone else jumped on the back of it. I don't know if that's being overly cynical, but interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, there are two things here. One is Lizzie and Dan were both bringing up this point of, to whom does that money go? Who gets to decide what a quote unquote reputable news source is? As someone who's deeply involved in American politics, we suddenly have seen this rise of very hyper partisan. You can't even call it journalism, but I could absolutely see a world in which Meta, trying to play a sort of domestic political game back in the States, says, okay, well, more money is going to go to whomever to try and play whatever game is happening here, instead of actually going towards reputable news sources. So figuring out who gets to call that, who wins that game, I think is something that as someone who's not necessarily an expert in this story, that's something that I'd be very curious to see. But the bigger picture question, as I was reading through this story before we were coming into this, is this really seems to be a bit of a test case, for at least from my perspective, about the question of legal responsibility for content on these platforms. In the U.S., these companies have always declared that they are not responsible for the content on their platforms. That uh, this is how they've always avoided any freedom of speech issues, where they'll take things down, but they don't accept legal responsibility. And they've always fought against this. This has been the hallmark of how they present themselves, is that they're not news outlets in the way that a newspaper or radio station or TV station is. And so they are not subject to those sort of broadcast limitations. So when we're talking about must carry obligations, that these platforms have always fought against that on the grounds that they are not the same thing as a television station or any of those others. So I think what I'll be curious to see in the reaction to this is, do they follow the same logic as they try and argue against this? Are they responsible for news content or for anything else ending up on their platform, or do they continue arguing that all they are is sort of a neutral platform or neutral arbiter between people and brands and whatever else? Because certainly a must carry obligation, or any sort of obligation to carry a particular brand or a particular type of content, would be really antithetical to how they've presented themselves as these sort of neutral arbiters.
Except there's nothing neutral about an algorithm, and
No.
I think that as soon as you are making decisions about what is going to be most prominent on your platform, you are entering into the realm of publishing, and I think you should be held responsible for that algorithm. Not necessarily responsible for everything that everyone publishes on your platform, but certainly what you feature prominently, and some transparency around that is really critical, because as I touched on at the start of this part of the conversation, if more than half of the population are getting their news and information from social media, and that information is being determined by the social media algorithm or by the search algorithm, then some transparency around what is driving that, I think, is absolutely required. And for the same reason that I said earlier, that journalism is a public good.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I want to be clear on that. I absolutely think you're right. I'll be very curious, I think, to see how these platforms, what their argument is against that, and where that ends up going.
Let's round out the news. My piece to bring to the table this week, I don't know if it's just because the name has attracted me, but off the back of Brian Merchant's fantastic regular updates, Blood in the Machine, he pointed readers to the idea of an AI slop tax, which is being proposed by a New York activist called Mike Pepe. He's put a paper up, which again we can put in the show notes for discussion. But the idea of the slop tax, it's almost like a form of reparations plus, remediation of pollution for the impact of generative AI, both on production and research. The idea is that the large language models, the AI companies, would be required to put a percentage, he's saying about 1% of their market capitalisation, into a cultural trust vehicle in countries they operate, which would then be distributed to fund the creative life of those nations, with an independent board distributing the money that's equally made up of creatives, technologists, and governance. It had a little bit of appeal as a counterpoint to the idea of secret transfers and deals going on, and again, dealing with one of the real dangers to democracy and civility that the large language models are creating. I'm interested. I did not give people a long time to look at this, so I feel like it's just a bit of a vibe check at the moment. But there's a couple of components there. One is this, it starts to sort of differentiate between positive use cases and general use cases. It looks at impact, and it also looks at creating some way of maintaining human-centered culture out the other end. So without being an expert in it, has anyone got a sort of gut reaction to that idea of an AI slop tax?
I mean, on one level, I'm fine with it, but why do we? We're contending with the problem of very large companies dominating infrastructure of the web, and we keep coming up with clever ways to disguise taxing them. And maybe that is because
Well, this one's actually called a tax, so I don't think it's a disguise.
no, but it's like, okay, well, we think governments should spend money on cultural enrichment, investing in cultural sectors. That is all true. And like, I understand why you need to force them to do it. Why do we necessarily have to have a specific kind of fund coming from these things? I mean, it's built off the News Media Bargaining Code. There are potential benefits to this, as opposed, like, I see the utility in forcing it to be spent on cultural activities, whatever, in cultural investment. And
Yeah, it is like an extension of a News Media Bargaining Code, isn't it, with a lot more
but it's
money.
also like
but
separate
also,
from government. But like, you know, are those things ever sort of separate from government? Like, I just, you know, like,
what are they saying? They want to put money into continual artist wage support, bedrock support for cultural institutions, one-off grants, temporary infusions. Depends
yeah,
how
well,
bad you think the impact of this is going to be on the creative arts, I guess. And
maybe,
also,
but maybe we should just invest in creative sectors anyway. Like, I'm not trying to be facetious, but I just do. Like, the problem is these companies are too big, and they've get engaged in, I think, a form of regulatory capture, because now people are trying to accommodate their business model rather than question whether it was lawful to begin with, because that seems too hard. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we just now try to deal with the fallout and do that in direct ways. But I do think there's a kind of a larger piece missing here, where we've ceded a certain amount of control to these large corporations, because the message they get is, if you can get big enough, you can weaponize users, you can weaponize your funders, like venture capitalists, to shape the regulatory environment in your own image. That's the message that gets sent. And so I just do worry about letting go of the idea that actually you should comply with the law, and if you don't, you pay a price for it, I suppose. Anyway.
would you tax Slop, Jan?
Would I tax Slop? No, I think this is attacking it from the wrong side. I think you need to be solving the Slop problem by making it impossible or illegal or whatever to take creative work and then use that to create Slop. I think if there was some work that went into the both the training and the inference of when any artist's work is used to create Slop, then you're probably going to see a lot less of it too, right? Because you're going to, if there's a cost on these companies being able to steal people's creative output in order to create Slop on top of it, then you're probably going to see a lot less of it. I mean, you know, I love the idea of giving more money back to the arts, and you know, there was a fantastic speech that I think Tim Minchin gave recently at the Opera House, where he talked about exactly this, and the really important role that government plays in just helping the creative industries function, which is just getting more and more difficult in this digital age, right? As now even creative works are being sucked up by these large digital platforms. But I think this is attacking it from the wrong end. I think you need to attack it from where the work is being stolen, not from the rubbish that's being generated on the top of it.
Let me make the case one more time, because I think particularly with culture, like, to their credit, artists have stopped the changes of copyright to make data mining an exemption. But there are two things that haven't been dealt with. One is, who's going to pay for everything that's been taken up already? And I know in the States, Cory, there's a couple of cases. Anthropic is one where a small amount of money has been made available to authors. But the real settlement should be an ongoing income stream, because once they're stolen, they're trained, like the models are trained on this stolen content. So the idea of a 1% market, like something that's embedded if the industry grows, like maybe it all booms and, you know, then busts and it's a bubble thing, and then none of it's worth anything anyway. They've got to go back and start again. But in the other scenario, if these are going to be the world's most wealthy companies, which is obviously what Sam Altman's banking on, surely it shouldn't just be a one-off $3,000 payment to someone that's written a book, but a percentage of the value of that industry should be, in an ongoing way, going back to cultural producers and the people who have been ripped off. I don't know. What do you reckon, Cory?
Yeah, I'm going to take a very brave stance and say that there are parts of everything that all of you are saying that I think is right.
You sound like an AI on the one hand, on the other hand. Great question.
Great question. Thank you
You're
so much for
nailing
asking.
it.
Look, two things are coming to mind as you are talking about this. One, it seems like this is an interesting flip on this question of AGI, UBI, Universal Basic Income, of, AI is going to sort of offset or shift a lot of human productivity and human capacity, and so because of that, the profits from those companies need to be used to be invested in other human resources. So, which I find really interesting. I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors in 2017 when we were beginning to talk a lot about this and beginning to engage with this. And Mayor Michael Tubbs, who was then the mayor of Stockton, California, was really leading the charge on this. And I don't know. I don't have a really strong opinion on that concept of UBI, just because I think that human society ends up adapting in interesting and unique ways, and we always sort of end up finding new things to do. But the other thing that keeps coming to mind as you all talking about this is I latched on to you talking about the market cap of these companies, because obviously the market cap of these companies is dramatically higher and dramatically higher than anything that it should be or anything that represents anything near reality. You see the market cap on these AI startups that are coming out of any of these tech hubs that are just 10 times higher than they should be because they have the word AI on them. So I sort of wonder how that would work, or if companies would begin doing the opposite and devaluing themselves so they would have to pay less. Because obviously right now the incentive is build this massive market cap to get venture capital money and sort of continue the sort of quasi Ponzi scheme that requires them to continually add new users at a rapid clip. But in general, I think I continue to agree a little bit more with Lizzie's point of view here, that like we just need to invest a lot more in cultural resources. And I would say just like, I think the more simple solution is probably the more blunt one, which is that companies that are this big need to be paying their fair share, and that in itself should be invested in creativity and in arts that make our society better. Like to me, I think when I read stories like this, I just get a little frustrated that it feels like we're just getting a little cute, and instead these are just big companies that should be contributing to the rest of our society. And yes, I agree with what Dan's saying about make it more difficult for Slop to come out and make it, we
they're
should
not.
absolutely have.
They're not contributing. They're taking. No. They're extractive companies.
That's correct. And I think, we have to find ways to regulate and to move these companies into not being extractive and into being sort of pro-social. But at the end of the day, tax them and regulate them. Don't, I feel like we sort of need a much more blunt instrument than I think maybe what's being proposed.
All right, we'll put that one in the needs to do further work. But I do like that the ideas are being put out there, and I also like that Slop is the villain. Let's talk a bit more about your work and how you got to be going around Australia talking. And so the background is Cory's been going around to smaller regional communities to talk about some of these issues as part of your research, but also part of, broader activism and outreach. Do you want to talk a bit about what brought you to Australia and, what you're trying to achieve with the work you're doing at the moment, Cory?
Sure. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I come from a decade in U.S. politics. I spent 3 years in the White House under President Biden, and then came here in 2024 to work on a PhD at the University of Melbourne, where I look at the impact of individual interactions with social media algorithms on political decision making, and especially this sense of the legitimacy of democracy as a system, and which is a really exciting new field. There are lots of interesting folks doing work in this space, but I think being able to merge those two, I come from a really rural and poorly funded and underserved part of the United States. I'm from rural South Carolina, which is historically known for having some of the worst education in the U.S. And so I'm very cognizant that a lot of this work that we do at universities or think tanks or any of these big institutions really just gets left there, sort of within the walls of the university, and that ideas don't get challenged outside of that. They get challenged on academic grounds, but not on sort of the grounds of how people actually live their day-to-day lives. And so I took those two things together, and also just as someone who wanted to go see a little bit more of Australia than an average American tourist might. I got to put together a tour with a huge amount of help, thanks to a bunch of local councils and libraries and all the rest, to go around a couple dozen regional communities around Australia to have conversations. It was a little bit very minor sort of opening monologue, but then mostly just opening space for people to ask questions of me, of their neighbors, about what role they want technology to play in their society. So I could be there to answer, the certain questions that I could about these big companies or AI itself. I don't pretend to be a developer or anything like that, but really just going around into these communities and trying to open up that conversation. Because I think what we're hitting on in all of these stories that you talked about today is we're beginning to have this conversation about what this technology, what AI means in our daily lives, in our political lives. And I think a lot of people, especially outside of those big institutions, the universities, the big cities, the big research institutions, feel like they're being left out of that conversation, feel like they don't know how to engage in that conversation because no one's having it with them. And so I got to go and do that. And it was an incredible experience, and I look forward to doing more of it next year.
And what were some of the surprising things that came through the Q&As or the discussions there?
Every city was radically different. I remember I was in a small town in South Australia, and every single question for an hour was about surveillance. And I couldn't quite figure out why. I spent a bunch of time on the news trying to figure out what was going on, and there was no big news stories, but apparently that had just sort of caught on as the thing that people were really concerned about. There were another one in South Australia talking about the energy issues. So it's not necessarily that there was a single question that really blew me away, but it was really how knowledgeable everyone was on these issues, and but really also how much they wanted to have this conversation. They felt like they had no room in their lives or no other place in their lives to go and have a conversation about what this stuff means. These are people that listen to podcasts like this, that read pieces like all of you have written, but don't have those communities in their town of 5 or 10,000 people, and so they don't feel like they have control or agency in these political environments. So that was the thing that I really kept picking up on.
Not sure how many listeners we've got in regional South Australia, but hello to all of you if you are listening. Lizzie?
What's the antidote to that though, Cory, in the sense that, like, one of the things I'm pleased to hear is that people want to talk about this. I assume often, what often comes out of some of the commentary on AI is that the population just needs to get on board, and their concerns or trepidations are just misguided backward thinking. Whereas I am, like, my experience of talking to people is that they are interested and engaged. They don't always share the opinions that I have about this stuff, but they do want to talk about it, right? And people might have traditionally done that through a local newspaper or through a community council, whatever it may be. And I sort of think, there's a real potential in the return of citizens' juries, because some local governments experiment with that, like asking people's opinions, just, inviting that participation in. But is there I don't know whether I'm jumping to the end of your PhD here, but what do you think is the antidote, or where is the place in which people can talk about these things? It should be easier than ever, given the tech can facilitate it, but it just seems like there's potentially a political appetite problem for seeking or engaging that kind of feedback.
Yeah, I think this is where my retail politics background shows up, in that I don't think that there's some big fancy technical solution to this. I think it's that people like the folks here on this podcast, or people who are just interested, should just show up in these communities and do some legwork to invite people into that conversation in person, in real time, where people are. And shouldn't just host something in Melbourne and hope that someone from a town takes the time out of their day, but go to that town of 5,000 people and host that conversation. And what I found was that these local libraries, local schools, local organizations all across these communities were so willing to host them, to reach out, to do the legwork, to bring people in and to engage with folks in these conversations. Um, I think my solution, and there are certainly plenty of very tech forward solutions, but I think the one that I found and that resonates with me is just show up where these folks are. Um, I in the States, I worked on a voter registration campaign, not something that y'all really have to deal with here in Australia. Um, and what we dealt with a lot was that a lot of communities were hesitant. They didn't feel like their vote mattered, and they felt like the process was onerous. And so the team that I was working on, we partnered with barbershops and beauty salons, places where people go to get their hair cut or anything sort of done in that space. And we trained barbers and salon owners and beauticians on how to have that conversation because people wanted to talk about it. They wanted to engage with it. They didn't want to do it on, in some like website that feels very clinical where they're going to, be asked their opinion on a Zoom thing where they have to record themselves for 30 seconds. They just wanted to be around their neighbors and talk about something that really mattered to them. I think the answer here, at least to me, is to strip a lot of the technology away from it and just get back to the hardwiring of the human brain of just have a conversation with the people around you. Because that's ultimately the only way that we have here.
But Cory, do any of the companies even come, or the big tech companies even come close to that? I mean, one of the frustrations of being in a country like Australia is that you get these big tech platforms that are largely built for America, right? The largest market in the world. And, just the financial incentives of winning that market just trumps everything else, because if you win in America, everything else is kind of a rounding area. Certainly Australia is. I mean, maybe not Europe, but certainly Australia is. And so you end up getting these platforms which, they're designed for a completely different audience to us. Well, not completely different, but a different audience, with different regulatory regime and often a more lax one. And so we just kind of have to take this in Australia. I mean, you then take that to a regional setting. I mean, it would be even worse, right? Like, so do any of the tech companies, do you think that there's any hope of them actually engaging with the communities in the way that you have suggested? I haven't seen much evidence of it happening even in, Sydney and Melbourne, let alone outback WA or South Australia.
There are a couple things there. One, this is actually a huge problem in the academic literature and the academic work of studying how anyone interacts and engages with these companies, is that almost all of this work is done in terms of psychological work done with Americans. And we have a fundamentally different view of these companies than anyone else in the world because these are American companies. The representatives that I vote for can directly regulate the bottom line of these companies. That's not true anywhere else, or really anywhere else in the world. It's a huge problem in the academic space. And as we begin to understand this, because as you develop surveys and tools, you cannot use the same ones for Americans as you do for anyone else. And I think that's been a big stumbling block in the last year or two of this research. I'm not seeing these companies do that. Like you said, there's to them the markets here are a rounding error. But it's interesting you bring up Europe. Something that I've been seeing a little bit of chatter about recently is how do you get Australia or any country to be in an economic union of some variety that has economic consequences for some of these companies. The reason that Europe is able to do something, even though the individual countries are quite small, is because the regulatory market is shared and is roughly the same size as the United States. What would happen if all of the ASEAN nations suddenly had a similar regulatory framework that they were able to go to these social media companies and say, we will negotiate with you as a block, as a group of 1 billion people with a market cap of X, rather than an individual country of 26 million people and whatever the revenue is from these countries. I'm interested in that idea. But ultimately, I think especially as you're talking about these, they're not even doing that engagement in regional parts of the United States. They've decided that they are so big that they can foist upon anyone whatever they want. And I think that that's quite a shame. But that I guess the sort of political philosophy behind the tour that I'm doing and a lot of the work that I'm doing is I don't think that's the end. I don't think you just accept that as like, well, that's always how it's going to be. Like all the stuff that we just talked about were potential regulations in Australia that the government could enforce, that people could use to change how these companies operate. And that requires bravery. That requires political will. And it requires, political risk as well on behalf of politicians, but also on behalf of the people who are voting for these folks. So, yeah, I think you have to continue to have these conversations regardless.
But can I ask you, Cory, are the companies the right people to be doing this anyway? Like, is it the job of elected representatives to do it? I mean, one of the things people say about Australia is that we have like too many levels of government. I don't necessarily share that criticism, but we have local government, state government, and federal government, whereas lots of similar countries don't have as many layers. But I see some benefit because local governments could do more of this kind of community consultation work and then feed it up towards state and federal, depending on the kind of issue or whatever it may be. And I do wonder whether we've got to impose more on reps or put the pressure on representatives to solicit views from the public or find ways for them to be responsive to them, the publics that elect them, rather than asking companies to do that consultation work. But I don't know if you feel like there's a distinction between that or, say, the public service as a body for that kind of consultation or engagement. Who do you
Yeah,
think?
I definitely don't. I don't have any hope that like Meta is going to start showing up and having these conversations in a meaningful way. I could imagine them doing something where they show up in a community and they ask a few questions, but I don't have any hope that goes anywhere. I think you're right that this is the value of local government, but I think it's also the value of academics and people who work at think tanks. And it's like people should be going out and having these conversations regardless of a government lever here, because ultimately it's about building a political conversation that needs to go further than an elected official. The other thing that I'll add is we also need elected officials who understand how these technologies work and how these companies work. How many times have we seen question time or a hearing in the US or whatever other country where where elected officials just clearly know nothing about how these platforms work, about how they're impacting our society. We need to have, and we will at some point have people who understand these platforms, who understand the implications that they have. And a lot of that is fueled by some of this grassroots work to go, and they need to hear from their constituents about these things that are deeply important to them. I think that's what really bubbled up to me in these conversations is people would talk to me for half an hour about how much this mattered in their lives, about the information their kids are seeing, about how what they're seeing, anything in this digital space. They clearly care about it, and they don't feel like anyone is listening to them. The companies, the governments, nothing. And so they're losing hope in that. And I think that's the value of going out and having these conversations wherever they can be.
So, Cory, I'm sure there is some value in it, and I commend you for doing it. Here's another challenge that I'm just going to throw at you, just to round out this rather dispiriting, potentially way of solving this. Maybe you've got a more hopeful way. So, let's say that elected representatives do better at this, and they go and they speak to more local communities, they get their input on these, and then we decide to come up with a whole bunch of local regulations to try and deal with some of the downstream consequences we're seeing of these US companies sort of coming into our territory. The risk we've got now, though, particularly with the current US administration, is that they're going to effectively try and water down those as much as they possibly can, or eliminate those as much as they possibly can. I mean, this is also a risk with the news bargaining incentive that we spoke about earlier today, right? I mean, there's a chance that the Trump administration just uses whatever leverage they've got, tariffs and everything else, to try and kill that, just as they have done with other countries and other territories around the world. So, what are your thoughts on that? Is there, as someone, this I guess isn't specifically related to the project that you've been working on lately, but as someone who's spent a bit of time in the White House in the US and here, what should Australia do? What do you think is the answer for us in dealing with the current circumstance where we've got potentially the risk of an administration which is going to be hostile to what we want to do locally.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the question that bubbles over pretty much every facet of policy anywhere in the world, especially among countries that have significant financial, political, or cultural relationships with the United States. Is obviously just Trump's mercuriality. And this is going to be easy enough for me to say as not an Australian citizen who sort of is engaging in all this. But I think at a certain point, you just got to be brave enough to do something that's in the interests of your citizens. And if Donald Trump decides to have a panic about it, then you sort of have to stand up to him. I think one of the reasons that Albanese did quite well in his meeting with Donald Trump is Albanese stood up to him and said, "This is what we're going to do. This is what I can offer you. And also, I have support back home." And Trump respects that. Um, I I would actually be significantly more worried if this were President J.D. Vance, who is much more ideological, much more tied to Silicon Valley and sees any attack on Silicon Valley as an attack on his friends. I actually think that Donald Trump respects when countries are willing to stand up and say, we're going to go and do this, and we're gonna stand our ground a little bit. He's a classic bully in that if you stand up to him, he will back down a little bit. Again, easy enough for me to say, but I think that this is something that clearly people care about. And I think Australia is leading a lot of parts of the world on having these conversations. And I also think you have to balance it out. One of the reasons that Australia can be in a particularly useful position on stuff like this is because of your critical minerals and because of relationships in other places where you can triangulate that relationship with the United States. But I think ultimately, when it's something like this important and something that is literally at the core of a democratic society, I think at a certain point you just have to be a little brave and have to push forward on doing something that your citizens clearly care about.
Well, I think also like pandering to him is no guarantee of success either, right? Like he's such a mercurial individual. I mean, my social media, at least this week, talk about getting news from social media, was dominated by Mamdani's meeting with him, and just how unexpectedly well that went for the new elected mayor of New York City. Like, I think defying everyone's predictions, right? And that is partly because Mamdani was just very comfortable in what he was doing, and there's lots of different theories about it, but it's an example, I think, of taking a particular approach to Trump and getting a differential outcome. So I just don't think there's any guarantees with this administration as well. So I think for local elected representatives, you've got to continue to represent those who elected you, whether you really want to or not. That is your job, right? So it's sort of, I'm grateful that you're looking into it, Cory, because I agree with you. Like, academics have a real role to play in bringing forth these ideas and putting forward an evidence base for a certain approach to policymaking. One of the questions I did want to ask you before I think we round out, because we have lost Peter, but I do want to finish. I'll be the person responsible for finishing the show. But one of the things I wanted to talk about before I just get to you and what you're doing over the next little while is your comment about giving elected representatives information or capability and skilling them up to confront these issues from a policy perspective. Sometimes I think they don't want to, but other times I think your identification of the problem is 100% accurate. They need assistance from academics to understand the nature of the problem. And there is some experiments in the US that I saw, at least under the previous administration, to facilitating that kind of dialogue with academia, where elected representatives can seek research or have a kind of frank and open back end exchange, shall we say, to facilitate that kind of skilling up. That is something I think we could do more of here, like trying to find ways to do that translation work and to also receive feedback from MPs about what they need to do their job well. I assume that's one of your projects, is to kind of take this to people in positions of power once you've finished your research. But is that kind of on your agenda too?
It is, and thank you so much for letting me pitch what I'm doing in the next week with your coworker Jacob Varkes. I think that conversations about this, especially from academics, especially from folks interested in policy research, we need to stop talking about this like it's something that no one else can understand. Because it doesn't have to be. So many of these folks talk about AI like it's something that you need a PhD to understand, or we talk about these policy agendas as if you need to spend every moment of your day obsessing over the details. And we've just spent an hour having a conversation that I think most people could follow about the way that these things impact our daily lives. And we need to do more of that. I think so many people hear this thing about AI and sort of check out and go, that sounds big and scary. I don't really know how to deal with it. And so absolutely, being able to translate that for elected officials is really important, especially for elected officials who are interested, but again, feel like they don't know or they don't have the capacity to be able to go back and talk about it. So I'm taking a sort of tangential approach to this, which is I'm starting a late night show where we talk about AI and society. We have a whole bunch of fantastic comedy writers coming from the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. We have some great guests, including Jacob Varghese from Morris Blackburn, some great academics from the University of Melbourne. I have a band led by a fantastic cabaret artist named Tash York. And we've done some really cool content that will be coming out over the next couple of weeks, and we'll be recording it for the ABC, which I'm really excited about. So, but it's finding ways to have conversations in unorthodox ways that people are going to find a little more interesting and are willing to pay attention to. And look, I make my money as a columnist. There's plenty of room for us to continue to write columns. But we also need more diversified forms of media to have these conversations with elected officials, with the general public, and just finding as many different avenues as we can to build this conversation is ultimately the project that I'm interested in. And this comedy show, which if anyone is in Melbourne on December 3rd, we're hosting it at the University of Melbourne's Union Theatre at 6:30 p.m., which I'm really excited about and also terrified because I have to host a whole late night show.
We can give you some tips there.
Thank you. Would be much appreciated. Yeah. So, we just have to continue to find ways to have these conversations and to give people avenues in where they don't feel like they're going to run up against a brick wall, where they feel like they can take that and run with it in their own lives. Yeah, we're going to be having lots of fun. Once we stop recording, I'll tell you what jokes we have planned for Jacob that he doesn't know about yet. We have lots of fun things we'll engage with. So this can be an exciting conversation for people to have.
Sounds like something we'll be coming back to at various points along the road. Hey, we better wind it up because I know Dan's got important business to be getting to. But Cory, thanks for being part of Burning Platforms. Welcome back, Lizzie, and we'll speak again in a fortnight. You have been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on November 24 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.